next speaker, Pascal Gagneux, is going to come up. He is the Associate Professor of Pathology and Archaeology at UC San Diego. His talk is called "We Are the Paradoxical Ape." He didn't have a hiding place when he was young, but he was not allowed to have toy guns, so he would carve his own toy guns out of pieces of wood and sort of hide them and use them indiscreetly. I thought that was really cool. His candy bar, he's not a candy bar guy, but he loves Swiss or Belgian chocolate, which is very specific. Apparently, the way the Swiss incorporate the sugar into the chocolate is a rubbing, vertical rubbing versus a circular rubbing, which makes it totally different. Ask him more details. She's a shower person versus a bath person. His boat would be called the Ooh La La Flying Fish. And the question he would want answered, if he could have any question answered, would be, what made humans human? Interesting. Please welcome Pascal Gagneux.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Is the microphone on? Can you hear me okay? Good morning, everyone. So today's, can we have the first slide, please? I'll be talking to you about how we are apes, but I hope to convince you that we are very strange or paradoxical apes. And to illustrate that, I show you a member of one of our closest living relatives here, the famous Frodo at Gombe National Park, and an astronaut in space. Somebody is going up and somebody else is going down. So to start, I thought I'd give you a little bit of feeling of what our close relatives do every day. This is a group of chimpanzees in Gombe, two males greeting each other, kids playing in the background, other adults grooming each other, very peaceful. Most of you have seen documentaries, have been convinced that you know that they use tools, they have culture, they have lifelong friendships, very complex social interactions. They can go instantly from a peaceful scene like that to a slightly more worrisome scene where somebody gets excited, nobody knew what happened, and the big alpha male vocalizes, hairs on end. You can see the female with the baby clinging with the Moro reflex to her belly. That's a mom that has a little baby. So chimpanzees and other apes have been in the news a lot on documentary channels where you can hear all these amazing things that until recently we thought we were the only species. We Homo habilis, the tool-making person. These are beasts. They have nothing to do with us. We now know, of course, that we are apes like them. And I'll try to address today many ways in which we might be not just another ape. There is a school of thought out there that enough already, stop going on about how special humans are. We're just another ape. You know, we lost hair, we invented nukes, and that's the end of it. The other extreme position is something I like to call human exceptionalism, where you're convinced that there might be unique processes that are operating only in human evolution. And I think there's quite a few examples of that. It doesn't make us not an ape, but it makes us a paradoxical ape. If you look at the planet with some tools that through human technology and culture were developed, Landsat satellites, you can take a snapshot of the world at night. You can see where people live, at least where rich people live. That's where all the lights are. There's a couple of darker places with plenty of people, but they don't have money to generate enough power. Our closest living relatives, the two African apes, bonobos and chimpanzees, and the other great apes of Africa, the gorillas, and the few great apes in East Asia, in Sumatra and Borneo, the orangutans, are all restricted to forest habitats. They all have to make a nest each night, almost certainly as a defense against potential predation, and they cannot live where there are no trees. They even have a hard time living where there aren't enough trees for them to make a new nest every night. We, on the other hand, have taken over the entire planet, are in the process of destroying it. Since the development of molecular techniques that allow you to read DNA and allow you to read millions of base pairs of chimpanzee, orangutan, gorilla, and human DNA, you can compare these and you can create a phylogeny and prove that, yes, in fact, humans are more closely related to two species of African ape, the bonobos and the common chimpanzees, than any of these three are to the other apes. Which really would mean from an evolutionary point of view, we should call us pan, or these two species of pan, Homo. But we like to think of ourselves highly, which is why we call the group of mammals primates, because we're part of them. That must be the first, the best. It's kind of like the person driving the car that has the license plate on it that says chief or boss or something like that. That's the view that we have of nature, and it doesn't always serve us well. What we have massively expanded over our close living relatives, the other apes, is culture. And as famous anthropologist Lauren Brace put it, culture is a non-biological inheritance system. You transmit ideas. And what is interesting is that it can evolve very, very rapidly, and unlike DNA, you can inherit it upwards, sideways, in all directions. Your granddaughter can teach you how to use your new cell phone. That is inverse inheritance of ideas, right? And so that makes culture extremely powerful, and humans are quite good at using culture in a cumulative way. They ratchet it. One good idea, everybody copies it. We're not so good at having the good ideas, but if a large group of people, 2 people will have good ideas, and we all copy it, and then we add other good ideas or bad ideas to it. So I try to convince you that even though we are an ape, our human biology is completely infused with culture. And so when people talk about nature versus nurture, it's a complete waste of time. It's nature via nurture. These things are constantly happening together. And you cannot quantify the percent of something being purely nature. To illustrate this, we're right next to LAX. Look at a very famous recent human behavior. That's global air traffic. You're looking at 1 day's worth of flights on the planet. This information is, by the way, really important for epidemiologists because these are the new vectors, not mosquitoes. It's Boeing 747s that are our new vectors and move disease around. In contrast, all our close relatives, the other apes, here some chimpanzees as an illustration, they live on a territory 30 square kilometers, a little neighborhood of LA, that they jealously guard. The males are born there, they never leave. If they leave, they are dead. The females can leave when they have a nice big sexual swelling and are appealing to the neighbors. Then they can kind of ease into one of the neighboring groups. But men jealously guard the territory and kill each other if they get a chance. So imagine this thought experiment, and this was actually suggested by Sarah Hrdy, a famous anthropologist interested in cooperative breeding, and I talked to John about linking the ideas. That's the thought experiment. 300 unrelated male chimps in a plane. I got tired photoshopping after the 2 rows. It wouldn't be pretty. You don't have to know chimpanzees too well to know that it wouldn't be pretty. So here, congratulate yourselves. Many of you flew here in a plane full of unrelated other males, and you didn't kill each other. You didn't rip each other's throats out and rip each other's testicles off, which is usually what chimpanzee males do. So there's something that has happened. We are an ape with a lot of social tolerance. We can restrain from killing these very fearsome other people that are not part of our group. And it turns out that we live in this techno-cultural niche, and years ago, anthropologists like Donald Brown at UC Santa Barbara have gone through the body of anthropological literature, which is not perfect. It's mostly put together by white men who traveled the world in the last possible time you could observe people in their kind of original condition, which of course was not original anymore. They had exchanged ideas and transported metallurgy, and religions had moved and so forth, but studying mostly small-scale societies without central authority that tend to be egalitarian. This is a menu of the things that every known human society has. Shelter, the control of fire, hugely important. We don't even know how old it is. Probably at least 1 million years old, but as old as 3 million years old. Tool making, including hunting machines, traps you can make with a string and a couple of pieces of wood. Weapons, especially projectile weapons, bow and arrows, invented in Africa multiple times, died out, had to be reinvented until they left Africa with modern humans 70,000 years ago. Twining, weaving, where you make nets to capture prey or transport food back to camp. Containers, here's an ostrich egg, the famous canteen of early African hominids. Cooking, changing your food. If you go out here in Southern California, if you like plants and gardening, it's an absolute paradise. You can garden all year long. Well, 90% of the plants growing anywhere in LA, if you eat them, you're going to be very sick or dead, because these plants have evolved anti-nutrients so that they can grow without being eaten. We cook them And what we cook transforms the defenses of these plants into food we can eat. Try a diet of raw soybeans, you will lose weight and starve. But if you boil your soybeans, you can actually feed yourself using levers and tying material and so forth. But very importantly, we have symbols. At some point, the human ape or the ape becoming human started thinking of things that stand for things that are not here now. They might be somewhere else, but you have a stand-in, a symbol for them. And some of the earliest symbolic things are engraved ostrich eggs from Africa, or pieces of ochre, red dirt that was still is used in many tribes to decorate your skin. Also helps against insects and sunburn. We have personal names. When we study these chimpanzees, like I did for 2 years in West Africa, we give them names. The 2 years I was there, it didn't even hit me. We had chimps called Rousseau and Titan and Ulysse. I go, but that's incredible. We give them names. Of course we give them names. We want to talk about them when we go back to camp with our fellow primatologists. But they don't have names. They don't have language. They cannot talk about a third chimpanzee that's somewhere else. They can only interact in the moment. So there can be some kind of reputation. If a chimpanzee comes in and everybody agrees he's kind of a jerk, their body language will let the other chimpanzee know this chimp is a jerk. But they can't go over dinner, talk, can you believe what this jerk did again today, and tomorrow morning let's kill him. Which is actually something, it's one of the major reasons for homicide in egalitarian society is being a bully. That's for 200,000 years of being human. Fast forward now and you're a bully and you become president. So if you have names and language, you can have kinship terms. If you have pair bonding and a name for the father, you can have a certain degree of certitude that that's your father, and your father had a father and has uncles, and they live in another group. Suddenly you go from a group of animals that are totally intolerant to anybody outside except sexy females coming in, to a network of small groups that form a tribe. We have shared rituals, dance and music. We have sacred spaces that have some meaning that enters into the religious realm. We have group identity, where we as a group do certain things and we despise all the other groups that do other certain things. And that allows you to compete, but also to cooperate. It's both really, really good and very, very bad, because it brings up some of the most ugly things you see in our nature. So I thought I'll do a little experiment too, very much inspired by Brian this morning. What do you see here? You see a foot, you see a feather, what else? Hoof print. What kind of hoof print? Cow, good, but there's another one. Zebra. Okay, I'll tell you a little story. So this is in Tanzania, southern Tanzania, near Lake Eyasi. And over the last few years, I've taken a small group of graduate students of a special program we run at UCSD on the evolution of humans, the origin of humans, called Anthropogeny. 6 graduate students a year come with me to East Africa for 3 weeks, and we spend a couple of days with Hadza hunter-gatherers. And this particular day, I was alone with a Hadza named Sikwezi. We had slept and left the same camp in the morning, so he hadn't been to this place. We get there, that's his arrow. That's actually guinea fowl fletching from his arrow, and he's using his arrow to show me the footprint. And he names Philemon, the individual Hadza who left this footprint. Then he proceeds to show me the little hooves. Can you, this is too far. The little hoof just above the arrow are zebra hoof prints. And he proceeds to tell me, oh, it looks like Philemon hunted a zebra and caught it. And afterwards, the Datoga, the pastoralist neighbors, came through with their cows. It turns out we are the only species who can pull this off. Many animals are really good at tracking prey, but they track it through the molecules of the prey. They smell the molecule that was left by the prey animal. There is no molecules left here. It is a symbol. It is a footprint, and Sikwezi was capable of piecing together through hypothesis and imagination a story. And 2 hours later, we came to the camp where Philemon was busy dissecting the zebra he had caught. So this might be one of the ways that our species became symbolic. But that's just a very interesting idea promoted by Louis Liebenberg, who is a South African ecologist. We don't know what the transition was to becoming symbolic and gaining language. It's a very interesting topic, but it's extremely hard to audit something that happened 200,000 years ago. I'm sure you would agree that as cool as great apes are, and there's many things we still don't know about great apes, there is no end to uniquely human customs. Astronavigation, beekeeping, cycling, X-ray, yoga, and ziplining. You can just open any book and you'll find something that only humans do. Not necessarily all humans. Very few of us have been in space. But humans have been in space. So I'm not trying to diss great ape culture because it exists. It's very well documented that apes transmit behavior and it's a cultural thing. But what humans do is they add on. They have this ratcheting culture. They can innovate and the innovation doesn't die out. It actually lives on and becomes interesting and different. And there is a balance between innovation and conservation because if you innovate too much, you lose the so-called traditions. Most human societies value traditions, and not surprisingly, there are conflicts on the importance of tradition and keeping them alive and innovation and how they bring new ideas but also threatening ideas because they might completely mess up the traditions. So humans have this social cognitive process that includes teaching through verbal instruction. Teaching has never really been described for great apes. As much as people have tried. There is one paper published by my former PhD advisor who thought he saw teaching in 2 cases, but I have yet to meet another primatologist who agrees that teaching happens in great apes. In humans, there is a lot of teaching, not only verbal, but a lot through demonstration. So there's a group of very famous colleagues, primatologists, who have studied different species of great apes that have come up with a really interesting hypothesis. It's called the Jourdain hypothesis. Monsieur Jourdain was a fictional character in a Molière play who had a lot of money and no education. And so he wanted to learn how to speak like a nobleman. And after all these years, suddenly he said, "Par ma foi, il y a plus de 40 ans que je dis de la prose sans que j'en suce rien. Et je vous suis le plus obligé du monde de m'avoir appris cela." He suddenly realizes that he's speaking prose. It looks like chimps are not realizing that they have culture. In contrast to chimps, humans have reflective cultures. Each culture is almost too aware of how they are better than all the neighboring culture. And they know what they do, and they're proud of what they do, and they make jokes about what they do. And if they don't make jokes, then there's a big problem. They should make more jokes about what they do. It goes to our biology. We are so much into each other's heads that I can stand here, and if I violate a norm, like my pants fall down, I'm very likely to blush. So social norms invented by culture, what you're supposed to do or not do, or what you expect other people to expect of you, can cause you to blush. And Darwin called this the most peculiar of all human emotions. And especially if you're melanically challenged. All humans blush. But those of us who lost most of our melanin synthesis capacity, it's much more easy to read somebody blushing. Whether that had any role in losing melanin, we have no idea. But it's the fact that you use your biggest organ, the skin in your body, to advertise, with none of your control, your emotional state to fellow humans. It turns out that people have asked and published in the Annals of Improbable Results that if you take someone, you can't blush on your own. You need people present. But they empirically took a woman who was famous for blushing very easily into a completely dark room, and using a thermal imaging machine could show that she could blush in the dark, but only if others were present. And she was aware of that. I love this piece of research. I'd love to do more of that. So one of the key things we use to exchange ideas, of course, is language. It exploits human sensory faculties. Our cognitive biases are also shaped by it, and it waves together our brains. We travel, we exchange ideas. We can have a theory of mind of a character invented by Shakespeare. People have never existed, have been thought up by someone hundreds of years later. We think about them and we have emotions about them. This is incredibly powerful. We have zero evidence of any other species doing that. All species communicate. There's active research agenda studying cetacean communication and bat communication. But a generative language that allows you to generate infinite meaning, where you can make a story of something and then continue it by saying yes and, is not possible without language. And we have no evidence of another linguistic species on this planet. Huge questions. How old is language? How did it start? We have no idea. It's also a high-fidelity group membership signal. By now, you all perfectly know, after I said 2 syllables, that I'm not a native English speaker. I've lived in Southern California for 25 years. I love surfing. When I'm out in the lineup, I say, hi, one syllable. And they go, hey, so where are you from? After 25 years. So it's fun, entertaining, but it can cost you your life. You know, in the biblical time, the shibboleth being pronounced siboleth, they would cut off your head. So language can be used as an us versus them tool, and it's very, very high fidelity. It turns out that when Darwin and Huxley correctly predicted that our closest relatives must be in Africa somewhere, there must be ancestors that lived there, they had 0 fossils. The Neanderthal fossils were discovered in Darwin's time, but they thought it was some Cossack that was hit over the head or something like that. The good news is we now have fossils across Africa, and all the oldest hominid and hominin fossils, the branch leading to humans, exist only in Africa until about 2 million years ago. Very recently, a new fossil was found in South Africa that was named Homo naledi, had a tiny little brain. It turns out that is now only 250,000 years old. It was not an ancestor, it was a side branch. But we know that as possibly 350,000 years ago or 160,000 years ago, for sure 160,000 years ago, there were people walking around Africa who were by all definitions completely modern in terms of their skeletons. And this is attempts by world-renowned paleo artists to try to reconstruct some of these cousins and ancestors, including a contrast down there between Neanderthals and modern humans. And the last, at the further bottom to your right, is Jebel Irut, the 350,000-year-old skull from Morocco. So the good news is, unlike Huxley and Darwin, who predicted this, we now have a big collection of fossils from Africa for all the old stuff, and then after 2 million years ago, all across the old world. Only 60,000 years ago, people made it to Australia, and only in the last 13,000 years, people made it to the Americas. The caveat is all these fossils would still safely fit in the back of one pickup truck. So they're very informative, but it's not, you know, halls and halls full of fossils of hominids. They are matched with a huge collection of artifacts, stone tools, that start appearing about 2 million years ago and litter the African landscape. So what is amazing about human biology is that if you compare the schedule of development, life history, how long is gestation, how is birth, is there childhood, how quickly do you mature, when do you start reproducing, how long do you reproduce for, and how long do you live? One of the most striking differences between humans and the great apes is our schedule of life. Gestation is just a little bit longer. Birth is a heck of an ordeal for women because the head, cephalic-pelvic disproportion, the head is actually bigger than the passage of the pelvis. And then humans seem to have invented childhood, a period where the brain is developing like crazy, but somatic growth is not very rapid. There's this period of several years where kids don't grow that much, but their brain develops. Adolescence might be another such invention where there's a plateauing and then poof, peaking. In chimpanzees, the brain myelinizes by age 10, their connections are firmly wrapped by myelin. In humans, that only ends in the 3rd decade. So we grow up slowly and we take a lot of time to let our brain have cultural, behavioral, and social input. And then very strikingly, women can live for 30% of their lifetime after they have run out of eggs. In chimpanzees and gorillas, once females run out of eggs, there is no menopause because they usually die around the time that they run out of eggs, which is a similar time to humans. So the schedule of life in humans seems to be adapted for cultural opportunities, possibly nutritional opportunities. Becoming the top predator and cooking might be the condition without which you cannot make these costly babies. It might also have been facilitated by stronger pair bonds, which are seen in all societies around the world, which is not to say that there are not polygamous systems, but pair bonding is so strong in our species that it trumps sexual orientation. It might have been facilitated by allomothering, Sarah Hurdy's idea, that babies require multiple adults or adolescents to help them. I'll show you a little contrast of the mating systems in different species of apes. The gibbons, which are lesser apes of Southeast Asia, are monogamous. They can be serially so, but they usually live in pairs with a couple of kids, and they have this beautiful way of singing to defend their territories. That's the only known monogamous ape. In the gorillas, famously, you have silverbacks that during the time of their reign, they are the only father. They compete at the level of beating each other up to gain access and control a group of females, and then they produce tiny amounts of sperm and don't compete at that level at all. In orangutans, you have two systems where you have big flanged males that sing and attract females that are attracted to them and choose them. But you also have little males that go around force copulating the females, and they make up about half the paternity in these groups. In chimpanzees and bonobos, you have multiple males and multiple females that mate. For each ovulation, a female chimpanzee will mate with 12, 15, 20 males. And so nobody in a chimpanzee society knows who is the daddy of whom. In humans, we have a lot of plasticity, anything goes. There's a lot of evidence that in traditional societies, most individuals seem to pair bond at least sequentially. But the key difference is that the way humans mate is they exchange across groups and they keep track of who is where and who is related to whom. And that again is what allows us to have tribes and big networks across hundreds of kilometers. So the derived human growth schedule includes delays that allow increased transmission of behavior and concepts. That's what allows us to have this cultural niche. Human minds are copying machines, and the major target of that is language. You're all aware of the language-trained apes. Some of them are phenomenally impressive. Famous Kunzi, a captive bonobo, knows hundreds of characters, but he has yet to get up one morning and use the characters to go, and how are you feeling today? It's usually, give me some M&Ms, and then the blue ball, and then this. And he was trained by hundreds of PhD students who, positive conditioning. Human babies learn exponentially, and they pack in multiple languages automatically without instruction. So there's a lot of things that indicate that our delayed development is really a way we have biologically assimilated culture. And despite all this, we actually have shorter birth intervals than the apes. Apes in natural settings can make a baby about once every 5 years because they breastfeed, they lactate for up to 4 years. And in humans, that has shortened to around 3 to 3.5 years in natural fertility population. I can report to you that, I mentioned this already, that apes don't seem to have language and teaching. And I spent almost 2 years in the rainforest of West Africa following mother-infant dyads and looking how the young ones were copying the mothers, how they were using hammers to crack nuts and so forth. And I was convinced, this was part of my PhD thesis, I was convinced I was going to see that the mothers are teaching them. And even when teaching would have been so easy, they didn't do it. The little one was sitting there with a hammer and putting the nuts next to the anvil and then whacking the anvil like crazy. And the nut was next to it. All mom or dad could have done is just put the nut on the anvil, stupid. They did. So I'm very convinced there is no teaching, and I'm happy, as I said, I've yet to meet primatologists who have seen teaching. Part of this copying machine I mentioned, the brain, is a huge difference. Of course, apes already have big brains. The human ape is 3 times larger. We have a time series, it's really over the last 2 million years, coinciding with massive stone tool use. We can't audit any of the other tool use because they would have rotted. But stone tools are left behind. You can see both the tool itself and all the chips that flew off. The brain of humans has become really big, so big that it became difficult to birth this brain. It was not until quite recently, 2012, that a Japanese team, Satoshi Hirata and colleagues, who work with chimpanzees that are completely habituated to especially one human caretaker that goes in the cage every day, is present during the birth, then does interesting cognitive science research with the little chimp baby growing up. But they started during pregnancy, and so that was the first time that scientists could measure how a chimpanzee grows in utero by imaging it. And lo and behold, mid-gestation, both the rate of growth and absolute size of chimpanzee brain starts slowing down. Humans power straight through to birth, and after birth, for 1 year, our brains have a fetal growth rate. So humans have to give birth at this point because it's already almost too late. And then the brain continues growing like it was in a fetus, being exposed to lullabies and songs, hopefully, and not abuse and violence and poverty and so forth. The other extreme is old people. So you see here a comparison between chimpanzee societies across Africa and hunter-gatherer societies where up to a quarter of all living adults are postmenopausal, post-reproductive adults. This is a Hadza grandmother lifting a huge rock to look for tubers, and that simply, these individuals do not persist in the ape population. And we all are all too aware of the fact that many human societies are now top-heavy. They have so many old people that they have to import young people from other places to take care of the old people. This was not lost on many anthropologists, that grandmothers and grandfathers can help. How can they help? And I'll shift gears a little bit here and mention some work that I did with colleagues at UCSD, Ajit Varki's lab and my lab. We have an interest in immune responses and how immune responses can actually be costly. It turns out each and every one of your immune cells, represented here by a little egg-like looking thing, has receptors on it that can tell the immune cell not to overshoot. The immune system is a very powerful thing that keeps you alive, but if it's deregulated, it will kill you in a couple of minutes. So there is an idea called inflammaging, that one reason for aging is that every episode of an immune attack where you have to fight back invaders will cost you and make you become decrepit and aging. So there's a family of immune receptors on immune gel called Siglex. You can forget their name. It's just feelers that look for self. These are receptors on immune cells that will look at the body, constantly finger everything in the body and say, is this self? Is this okay? Do I have to react? No, it looks good. I don't react. And we have an interest in one of those because it was flagged in Alzheimer's disease. It turns out this comes in two variants. It's called CD33 or Siglex3. There's a genetic mutation that's present only in humans that switches how this thing works. And if you have the shorter version in green here, the minor CD33, it protects you from Alzheimer because it doesn't shut down. It's not a working break of the immune cells. So these immune cells will be better at eating the amyloid that corresponds to Alzheimer's disease. And so this is a mechanism. We found several other genes where this happens as well. What is interesting about this is it kind of throws a very important evolutionary dogma on its head. Evolutionary biologists have experimentally documented that natural selection can virtually not operate after you stop reproducing. But if you allow for culture and transmission of ideas and support of the baby that was just weaned by the old people, but the old people would be useless if they're demented. They would be a grandmother with Alzheimer's disease is not only no help for your baby, but it's a second baby you have to look after. So it might be that some of these genetic polymorphisms that help old people age without losing their minds, protecting their minds, opens up the post-reproductive phase to natural selection. And we found, in fact, a whole collection of genes that have changes only in humans, and all these changes are derived in other genes that are all related to inflammation and cardiovascular disease. A few words on the hunt for how different we are. It turns out, I mentioned, you can read the entire DNA. If you read all 3 billion letters in our genome, represented here at a scale of 1 to 1,000, the little yellow ball is a cell. The ball of yarn is a kilometer of yarn, which corresponds to the meter of yarn you have in each one of your cells. And humans and chimpanzees differ by about 5%. I know that's different from what you last heard. It's 1% about we're different. No, we differ by 5%. That's if you take into account the chunks of DNA that are only seen in humans and not in chimpanzees, as well as the chunks of DNA that have copied and multiplied in chimpanzees, but exist only as 1 or 2 copies in humans. So if you line up 2 times 3 billion base pairs and count all the difference, you get to 5%. I'm going to shock you now and tell you that actually women and men in this room differ by slightly more than 5%, 5.1%, which is the size of the X chromosome, which us guys are challenged by not having a second copy of. I'm not telling you which direction the difference is, but that's what 5% DNA can do. So there is an ongoing industry of people trying to home in on genes that were important. And a couple of years ago, with Majesta O'Bleness and Jim Sakala and Ajit Varki, we tried to summarize what was known about the type of genetic changes. This is a genome, a human genome. Chimpanzees have 1 more chromosome because they didn't fuse the second chromosome that is fused in us. Differences can be copy numbers, more copies in chimps, less in humans, or vice versa. Novel genes, genes that only exist in humans, And you look for the same gene in chimpanzees, they don't exist. And vice versa. Pseudogenes, genes that perfectly work in chimpanzees, but in humans you just find the rubble of what's left of a gene with a stop codon or 2 stop codons or missing exons. Evidence for positive selection, where in a human stretch of DNA there has been more change than you expect under neutral evolution, and expression changes. The exact same instructions, there's a difference, there's a reason why your hair looks different from a tooth. It's the same genome, but it's a subroutine that is expressed. So differences between chimpanzees and humans include genes that are there in the chimp, but they're not expressed in the brain of the chimp. They're only expressed in the epithelium in the chimp. That's super difficult to get to because theoretically you need a steady supply of tissues from chimps and humans to compare where what is expressed. Genes, of course, are only less than 2% of our DNA directly codes for proteins. It's about 20% of all the DNA that includes genes. So I like to give an idea of how big your genome is. This is a crowd of naked people in the Grand Plaza in Mexico City, where Spencer Tunick, who's famous for making these flash mobs of naked people in different places, Swiss glaciers, Mexico City. These are about 20,000 people. That's the number of genes you have in your genome, or the number of undergraduates at my university. But they don't act alone. Each one of them has hundreds to thousands of other chunks of DNA that we don't even call genes. They're called enhancers, promoters, modifiers, that talk to these genes. So just like the undergrads at my university, they have an aunt in Taiwan that calls them and tells them, oh, be careful, don't date the bad person, or, and friends that tell them what to do. In your genome, the reason you are the way you are is much more than genes. And the SNPs that people were mentioning, the single nucleotide polymorphism across your genome, they often are not in a gene. They might be near an enhancer, which has a tiny little influence on your likelihood to react to a phase in one way or to be more or less religion. In genetics, genomic psychiatry, people are realizing that almost anything they're trying to find genetic influence for contains more than 100 different places in the genome. And 100 is probably an underestimate. So next time you meet somebody who tells you this is the gene for this, I would caution you to just believe this simplistically. So many of these enhancers are themselves transcribed. That just adds to the complication. And this is just a brief overview of how the same gene can be subject to different influences in different tissues. So you have every cell in your body has all the same 20,000 genes, but one way a tooth and a hair or a lens and a sperm differ is that they play a different routine of these genes. And people are only slowly starting to find out what regulates it. These things are called transcription factors. Usually, technically, they're proteins that bind DNA and allow DNA to be read. But it turns out me talking to you is causing differences in your brain that affects your gene expression. And you looking at me a certain way causes emotions in me that influences the gene expression in my brain. So we are each other's transcription factors. And humans, through their hypersociality, are very much influencing each other's gene expression. So I quickly repeat that the social cultural niche in our species includes shared symbols. The sad news is for some people, a company logo has more emotional saliency than a human face in a homeless person on the street. That's how far we've come in niche construction. We have personal names, some of them too big on too many places. We have kinship terms, tribes, shared rituals, sacred places, group identity that is fantastic and very, very dangerous at the same time, and that same increased capacity to cooperate with and compete against other groups. So I hope I've convinced you that we are an ape, but that we're paradoxical. We're biologically cultural because our biology depends on cooked food. People in Germany have studied raw foodists. Women who are on raw food, 70% of them stop ovulating. So if you want to reproduce, which matters a little bit for evolution, raw food, in our case, is not a good idea. Chimpanzees are perfectly fine. They don't cook. We have become addicted to cooking. Our brain needs language input. If nobody talks to you, you start babbling or babbling with your hands, like in deaf children. So yes, we have an instinct that we want to develop language, but without the cultural input of the language, nothing happens. And our skin, the biggest organ we have, reacts to social norms. If I feel embarrassed, you can immediately tell because I light up red. But we're also culturally biological because the way we grow up and we develop has modified, appears to have changed in order to allow culture to afflict us even more, or influence us even more. The vast genomic landscape of how this is regulated and how this comes about is a very active ongoing research. The development of induced pluripotent stem cells actually allows us to take skin samples from great apes and humans, put them in a dish, let them grow into organoid little brains, and look at how chimpanzee neurons with human genes behave, or even more interestingly, human neurons with a Neanderthal gene in it, how they behave. But that's as far as we can go, because the opportunities for studying the phenotype of great apes, their bodies, their tissues, are almost gone. They mostly exist in zoos where they still breed a little bit, but the over 2,000 great apes in the US, mostly chimpanzees, that used to be used in biomedical studies are now all retired, and NIH doesn't fund anything on that, even though you could do beautiful research without any invasive or destructive research. And finally, I try to argue that asking these questions and learning about how we became human is really important for a lot of important topics today. One of them is why we get sick. Why do we get sick from the things we eat? Maybe we're not dirty enough, the hygiene hypothesis. Nutrition, we are omnivores. In fact, we only became humans because we became top carnivores. Now, with affluence, we know that eating too much red meat is really unhealthy. But without meat eating, humans would never have become humans. That experiment has been done. The robust Australopithecines lived for about 2 million years and have gone extinct. Humans have a profound pro-social nature. Yes, we're ready to nuke each other, but at the same time we care about each other. And even little children will, without any payment, they will help others they don't know. Great apes don't seem to care so much. We are completely changing how we reproduce. Luckily, we still have a lot of sex. A lot of it has nothing to do with reproduction. Half the pregnancies in the US are unintended, despite contraception. But most of us reproduce late. And if you reproduce late, especially as a father, you introduce more mutations into the sperm you make. 2 extra with every year you wait. How do we rear our children? There is strong evidence that children don't just expect the godlike mother, but that our biology has driven something that requires help from other members of the group. And finally, I was mentioning we were about to nuke each other, things like female prosociality and female solidarity might be the saving factor to prevent really bad things from happening. So I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit for questions regarding human origins. And if you're in Southern California, in a couple of weeks, we have another symposium that CARTA organizes. It's completely free on Friday afternoon at the Salk Institute on the role of hunting in anthropogeny. And if you cannot make it, it will be webcast. So I would urge you to go to our website, which is essentially cartaanthropogeny.org, which is a repository for a lot of information and hundreds of videos of past talks on topics ranging from neuroscience to archaeology and climate. And I thank you very much.
Pascal Gagneux. Wonderful. I'm sure you're aware, I'm reminded of the Mark Twain quote that says, humans are the only animals that blush or need to. I thought that was really good. Does anyone have a question? Maybe a few minutes for questions.
I recently read the book How to Tame a Fox, and it got me to thinking about how have dogs, or has this been looked into, how dogs have contributed to human
It's a very, very, very good question. So dog domestication might be as old as 30,000 years. Some rare paleontologists and primatologists think that maybe dogs were actually the secret weapon of modern humans coming out of Africa. There is no evidence for that, but as old as 30,000 years, so dogs was the first species to be domesticated, and they teach us a lot of things. Dogs are much, much better at reading humans than any of the apes are. Dogs get pointing, apes do not get pointing. They have white sclera of the eye, they follow the gaze. We are very good at gaze following, it's much harder. Most chimpanzee and other apes have dark sclera, they don't have the white. But the topic of domestication has been addressed, is really a living hypothesis. The idea that what we see, what we did to dogs or what they did to us, we also did to ourselves. The fact that 300 guys cannot kill each other on a plane ride to Zurich from LAX is partly that, yes, they're still aggressive, and they're still more aggressive than women on average. and you can exploit that. But they can sit in a plane for 11 hours with 300 unrelated males. And so we, compared to the apes, have retained many features that look more juvenile. Our faces are not protruding, which is a classical thing that happens when you domesticate foxes, for example. There was a famous experiment done in Siberia where they domesticated silver foxes for either aggression or lack thereof. Just by putting a glove into the cage. If they bit you, you go to the aggressives. If they didn't bit you. And these foxes are now pets. They have changed color, their snouts have changed. They have much more playful behavior as adults. So this is a very interesting idea that I don't think the dogs totally made us humans, but they are a mirror of what we might have done to ourselves even before we domesticated dogs. And that must have been in Africa because I have yet to meet an African who is not fully modern, which probably preempts a question about what about Neanderthal DNA. Those of us who are from outside Africa, on average, have about 2% of Neanderthal DNA. If that is what made us human, then the conclusion is that people in Africa who don't have these 2% are not human. When that result was published, the newspapers in France says, oh, the je ne sais quoi of human, that's the 2%. And in Ivory Coast, the newspaper said, we know why the whites are such brutal assholes. Same datum, two conclusions.
I love that those foxes actually develop tail wagging, just like dogs.
No, absolutely.
To please.
So it's a huge topic, and thank you for bringing it up.
Anyone else? Anyone else?
So it's commonly said that in the first world with medicine and science that selective pressure no longer exists. Would you say that selective pressure is occurring on a cultural level in the first world?
It's a very good question. The idea of dysgenesis, we buffered it so much that now the wrong people survive, and even worse, the wrong people have kids. So this goes back to old eugenics ideas in Britain that really the poor people are outbreeding us, the genius. Any study done on IQ, if anything, shows that IQ has gone up in all societies measured so far. That doesn't take away from your question that, yes, we buffer a lot of things with technology. Things like short-sightedness, but we also cause it. If you read a lot of books, you will need glasses. Thus the 95% short-sighted rates in South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. But it's a super interesting question. Almost certainly we have changed the selective field, but selection goes on now, mediated by social phobias because you never meet somebody, you only talk to them on the internet, for example. That's selective pressure.
Speaking of social norms, it's time for lunch, ladies and gentlemen. Another round of applause, please, for Pascal Gagneux.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're back.